Hey folks, welcome to this new video on Worldographer 2025. I'm Joe Wetzel, the creator of the program, and what you see in front of you is currently our beta version of the Worldographer 2025 major update. Um, and one of the things that we did that was very successful and very helpful to folks was created a couple of Worldographer 101 videos back with the prior Worldographer, which is actually Hexographer 2, if you're familiar with that. But anyway, point being is that we've got a new update that's got some significant changes, but 90% of it is probably going to be very familiar, and you're going to be able, if you're familiar with Worldographer, or if you're looking back at some of those other videos, which I'll probably be referencing for some of the details, it's certainly going to be helpful to look at those, and a lot of that information will carry over. But there are some new enhancements, new ways of doing some things. There's some back-end changes. There's more icons and lots of additional functionality. But in the case of the pre-existing functionality, like I said, it's probably 90% the same. So with that out of the way, what you see in front of you is just an auto-generated map that I made using our isometric icon style, which is something like Civilization, the computer game, like Civ 2, Civ 3, that era of graphics. For the most part, we are, as part of the Worldographer 2025 update, going to be adding in some more icons that are replacements for some of these that are classic, like this standing stone icon and this cave entrance icon and some other things like that, or tombstone rather, in that case. So we're going to be adding in some more icons before we go and call 2025 the official release. However, I will say that, if our track record with Worldographer is anything to say, we do put out a new update every month or so with some fixes as well as some smaller features that you get for free for having purchased Worldographer. You would see typically an update available up in the menu bar here if that's the case. Anyway, I also want you to note that with these icons that are here, they are a little bit of a squish style. This is our isometric icon style, and so they do have a little bit of a squished look to pull off a trick on your eyes. So create a new map though. We're going to go up to New World Kingdom Map, and that will bring up this dialog here. We got other videos, even with Worldographer 2025, that go over this in quite a bit of detail because all of this stuff is new. We're going to touch on all that stuff briefly, but we're not going to go into a lot of detail. I'll probably have a link to that other video below. I do want to point out first, the last thing on this screen is terrain icons, and so we're going to switch to classic, which is our Stara style icons. If you remember the TSR in the 80s with Basic Expert D&D in that series, and the Gazetteers and the Voyage of the Princess Ark Dragon magazine series, you can go ahead and check those out for the inspiration. But you're gonna see very much what they look like here in a moment. So I'm gonna switch to classic. Now, if you look closely, you would see that this increased in size because these are true hexagon shapes. They're not squished, so the height of our sample map increased, although the details were the same as far as what terrain was what. But this nice little preview mini map is really cool because I can go through the random seed and I can play with the random seed and see how that changes until I get one that I like. I like to get them kind of balanced, so this one would be balanced in my mind, maybe a little bit bottom heavy, but it's all right. This is unbalanced to me because it's way over here on the side. The algorithm does try to avoid creating maps that have stuff that will cross one side or the other. It doesn't account for balance, if you will. That's a subjective thing of mine, to each their own. Talking about the rest of these controls really briefly, hex orientation, do you want your hexes columns lined up like this or rows lined up going across? Map projection, this is a flat map projection. We can also do an icosahedral projection, and you can change how large is each of those triangles, how many hexes and rows of terrain will you end up having by changing how many hexes are on each side of the triangle. This is kind of like an unrolled D20. It's an icosahedral map projection. Some game systems like Traveler specialize in that. But for our purposes, I'm going to go with flat. It does mean that our scale is going to be excessive the further and further we are from the equator, essentially. But not to get on too big of a soapbox, but outside of your local campaign area, outside of where the players have explored and maybe one day's travel from there, your campaign world is very fungible. If the information that the player characters have would be very much based on old books that they've come across, secondhand, third-hand information, and so forth. So if you need to make changes further away, you always can. So kind of for that reason, I also don't get too hung up on scale of places either. But with this, so if we wanted to scale it with 100 hexes high and 216 wide, now the reason why that is, and again, we've got a whole other video on this, but this is going to give us a world that is roughly 120 something miles per hex at the equator, and then it's going to get further skewed from there. If you think about the Earth, it's a little less than 25,000 miles at the equator. The Earth itself is also a little bit squished, but regardless, this will give us a map, like I said, of about 125 miles. Also, with the reason why it's not 200 by 100 is because of the kind of the staggered nature of hexes. You have some overlap between those columns, so you want to account for that and give a little bit of a percentage. 216 might be right. This was just me picking something in the ballpark. It might be more likely 220, 224. I invite anybody who didn't get C's in college math to go ahead and do that math and let me know. So with that out of the way, those values can be changed here, but if you don't have the pro version of Worldographer, you're not going to be able to change these later. So you want to test it out and see what's the right number for you with some test maps, and then actually create the map that you want once you know what the scale is. Or if you have the pro version, you can always add additional columns and rows. Up on the tools menu, there's an expand slash shrink hexes or rows columns of tiles, I think is what it might be called. The scale of each hex, though, the size of each hex can always be changed. This is a true hexagon shape, and there's some information here down below here about the values that you should pick for that, as well as if you wanted to have the other icon set, what values you should pick there. If you have this checked, then it's going to preset those for you. Random seed we already mentioned. Configure terrain used if you want to swap out the terrain. If you have your own icon set for grassland and farmland and so forth, you can bring in your own icons and set them here, and then you can save those settings and reload them later if you need to. But that's what that dialog is for. And here, reset the map size and terrain defaults. It's just going to reset everything here to the settings, if you will. All one terrain is kind of cool up here. You can set the entire map to be, once I check that box, it can be all blank, or you can pick, hey, I want it to be desert cold, or whatever you want it to be. The nice thing about blank is that you can then hand place everything. You don't have to rely on our generator. So you can hand place everything if you'd like. You can also do something really cool, which is our terrain wizard, which does a nearest neighbor fill. So you just rough in, hey, I want some mountains here, and I want more mountains over there, and desert and forest and ocean all around, and boom, it will create that for you. If you want to create a region, so let's go back to this. You can create a region which kind of is just more of a kingdom area or a couple of kingdoms, half a continent, something like that. And this also does our nearest neighbor fill. It comes up, it puts down some different splotches of terrain, and then does a nearest neighbor fill. You can go to configure to change all of that. This is how prevalent is any given terrain next to some other piece of terrain. And then back to is full world, which is the settings that we had before, which we were talking about. And these values are designed to be somewhat Earth-like, but if you disagree, you can change them. Landforms, how much do you want your land masses to be continents versus islands? So you can play with those. Clustering will push those together or not, so this spreads them out more. Allow drift will spread them out even more. Number of nations, Worldographer will make a number of nations, a bunch of data about your world, where it will create cultures. It's got built in some language files, some syllable lists essentially, and it will use those to create cultures as needed, and it'll try to create a nation using an existing culture, like it'll give it a 50-50 chance of using an existing culture or creating a new one, and then create religions on those as well as needed. And so here it's going to create 20 of these. Classic terrain icons we talked about already. I did skip over here view level, initial view level. So one of the key things in Worldographer that adds quite a bit of complexity if you want to do it, or you can ignore it completely and just work with it as a flat map, is to have multiple map levels as opposed to layers. So this is different scales essentially of your world, where you can have at the world level, you might have 100 hexes across, and then you can drill down and say, I want 6 hexes across per hex in the parent map. So essentially, I'll have 600 hexes across for that same area of terrain, whether it's the whole world or whatever area you're happening to be picking. But you can drill down, and we call that the continent level. And then we have a kingdom level, and then there's also a province level that you can't select to start out because it works a little bit differently, just to preserve memory. And eventually you get to a point where you really need to have a powerhouse computer if you wanted to have all of that data in memory, because if you have 100 hexes to start, you do 6 to 1, you got 600, then you got 3600 by 7200. Anyway, you get into a lot of data that you would need to have, so we have some ways of mitigating that on the province level, so you can't select that from the get-go. But anyway, so you have this option to use this if you can create an initial map on a different level, but some of these generators are designed to only work on the world level. So I generally create my maps world and then drill down as needed. All of these other values I'm going to check off, and we'll talk about those in probably in other videos, or maybe briefly in this video. But you can do everything all in one step, where it will create the coastlines and rivers and hex crawl details and nations and empires and roads between the key locations, all in one step, which will take about a minute to run. Or you can do it later using the generate menu. All of those things are available on the generate menu once you have a world map open. The advantage to delaying it and doing it later is you can always tweak the prior step. You can say, I want to move some land around before I put down coasts, for example. All right, that was a long way to go. Let's go ahead and hit generate map. And all we get is just the land. So, since this is supposed to be a Worldographer 101 video, let's talk about the terrain drawer, which is what everybody wants to start with. And to place terrain, you just click the terrain type you want. So say I want these nice cultivated farmland icons, which are new in 2025 as opposed to pre-2025. Pre-2025, it was only this one. But if I want to say that there's a farming community down here, I can go ahead and put those icons down there. I've got a flood fill option, so if I wanted to do this whole section like that, I can do a flood fill. Wide area is going to affect not only the hex that I'm changing, but each adjacent hex as well. So I can put that down here in the ocean, and you can see that whole cluster of hexes will change. Similar, we'll look at the names of the terrain, and this is more for the other icon set, where it will randomly slip in some deciduous forest B, even if you have deciduous forest A selected. So that does that. And then shuffle will shuffle in some additional related terrain. So in this case, we can pick this. And so say if I do pick just light forest, and if I wanted to create a new forest down here, it's going to randomly throw in some additional related terrain. So we've got some forested hills, and we have some mixed forest, and we have some just open, clear farmland in there. So that's what shuffle does, and that's configurable by you if you'd like. It gets a little tedious to do it for very many terrain types, but if you want to configure it, you can pull up the configure dialog to get all the details of that. Select allows me to pick a terrain type and get the details of that terrain down here, so I can see what the elevation is for that particular hex and how prevalent on a scale of 0 to 100 are animal life and lumber and metals and so forth. Our algorithm for generating your world does take that stuff into account, where it will build cities where there's better locations, more resources available, for example. Coast, so I can pick a particular coastal hex, and it will put in strips of land to give me a prettier looking coast where it doesn't match up directly with the shape of a hex, my preference. Let's see. Deleting a terrain hex doesn't make a lot of sense, but you can do it. So I think that covers all that. Up here on the filter is cool. It lets you go ahead and say you can pick a category, so we can go to ISO columns just to switch to these. But we'll switch back to classic. The text filter is probably even more useful, so I can just type in forest, hit enter, and all of the forest types are going to appear for me. This is a nice selector too, where I can scale up the icons so that I can see them a little bit better, which is more useful for the isometric icons because it's hard to tell, hey, is this area regular forest or deciduous forest or what? But you've got that as an option. Let's go back to classic. Oh, I can right click these and I can add them to a favorites list. So I can say add to favorites. Once something is in the favorites, I can remove it from the favorites. But the favorites then go here, and so I can easily have my favorite icons set here for me for use later. Okay, let's go back to classic here. So I see these checkboxes here will just give this particular hex that I place a white background to it. So say if I wanted to have mountains, if I wanted to show that these mountains are especially high down here in the center, we had a couple of settings still set. So I just hit Control Z to undo that, turn those two things off, and those particular ones become icy. I can also override the background color, which I can do white, or I can do any other color. So if I just for some reason wanted to signify that these were special mountains, I can. There is a little bit of a bug there, so we are still beta, but I don't know if this is the underlying technology that we're using, the underlying libraries, or if it's something that we're doing. So we wanted to, so I'll look into that. But again, we are in a beta. And then I already did select to select these. You can set these values. So if I want to select this terrain type here, and if I wanted to say, hey, yeah, this is especially high. The average height of that particular hex is 16,000 feet, then I can set it to whatever value I want. And if I wanted to say that for some reason there's no animal life there whatsoever because it is so high, I can override that. And if I wanted to show, hey, there's also no lumber there we go. So that's what you can do with that. If I click this button, then any new terrain that I put down is not going to have the randomly generated by Worldographer settings. It's going to have whatever you've chosen here. So then if I put this next, oh, I had select on, sorry. And then all my values change because I had select on. But you get the point is then whatever terrain I place next is going to have. So if I put this mountain down here, then the terrain settings here, let's just pick a different one just so we see that it's different, and then come back to here. And yeah, even though it's a mountain, its elevation is only 34 because I overrode those settings. So there you go. That covers that. Zooming in, since we're talking Worldographer 101 type stuff, you can use your mouse wheel to scroll in, scroll out. You can use these plus and minuses up here. You've got scroll bars. I don't know why, but UI guidelines these days are saying there's no emphasis on scroll bars. I like them. I think they're useful. I think it's good to have. So even though one of the libraries we're using, makes scroll bars super tiny, I'm like, nope, I want my scroll bars back. So we've got them back. Let's see, I can refresh this display. So if this display up here is set to refresh on its own every so often. And if I make a big continent over here, okay, so you saw part of it. It did happen to refresh soon after I started, but you see it's not refreshing yet. But if I wanted to manually force the refresh, I can do that refresh. Pan lets me go ahead, clicking this button, and then clicking on the map and dragging is going to pan instead of whatever other control I might have set. But you can use it with your middle mouse. You can pan with your middle mouse button too, so it's not as essential as it once was. So that covers all of that. Up here, toolboxes. So if you want to pop all these controls out onto floating dialogues, we can do that. So that removes the drawer, gives you more space over there, and then I can pop up this window up here, and I can move that up to there and say I'm only working with the terrain drawer there that we had open. We've got this here, and so we can do that. And it's nice that you can have multiple things open more than just the mini map and the terrain drawer. For example, in fact, one thing that I haven't gotten to yet with the terrain drawer that we kind of skipped over was layer. So it used to be that Worldographer really didn't even expose layers at all. That you couldn't, it had its own internal thinking about layers of how to stack features and shapes and the terrain. But now we've exposed layers to you to have control over. So I can go into here to this last thing over here. Oh no, that's trace underlay. Layers here. Labels. Layers. There we go. That's the layers. Okay. So I can pull up layers, and this gives me that list of things, and I can stack. I can move things up and down on top of each other. One thing that people like to do is they like to move the grid down. In fact, maybe I should make that the default is to move the grid down a little bit below features so it doesn't overlap. Um, you know, different features of your map. But the key change, new thing in Worldographer 2025 related to terrain and layers is that you can now add terrain to other layers. You don't have to have it only on terrain land or terrain water. By default, any terrain that has water in the name goes on to this terrain water layer, and any other terrain goes on terrain land. Nowadays, enough people have asked to be able to put terrain on other layers. It particularly works out if you want to have an underdark region of your world. So I can go here, I can say, select a terrain, and then say add above selected, and I can have underdark, for example, or some other underground kingdom. Hit OK. I can turn off terrain land, and then I can take this mountainous type thing and, what did I do? I hit wide. Okay, and I put that on terrain land. Sorry about that. Okay, so we reset that. Let's go back to layer, though. Now on this layer drop down, if I set this before I place the terrain, I hit Underdark. Now it's going to be adding that terrain to the Underdark. And so I still had the big wide area set, but we'll leave that. So we have this underground mountain chain in the underground kingdom. There's lots of treacherous badlands, lots of caverns that are treacherous to go through. And so you can have that. There's also a couple of other Underdark type things. You can have an underground forest here. We can have an open area so that this is a little bit easier to go through. So you get the idea. You can make your underground kingdom underneath this island up here. And then we can turn terrain land back on, and people see that. And so if we turn it off, again, you can see the underground terrain. You can also do it for something above. Perhaps you've got floating islands on your world, and you want to show, and they're somewhat fixed in location compared to the rest of the surface. You can do that as well. So I believe that covers all of the stuff about terrain. I personally typically don't use the toolboxes, so I'm going to turn those off and go back over to this stuff here. We can talk a little bit about features. I'll probably, see, we're already at 26 minutes. Let me just talk about just the most basic things about features. This is placing a feature, so I can just go ahead and click on a particular thing, put it on the map, and there you go, it's there. You can check a place freely box, and so now, instead of it being centered in the middle of a particular hex, it'll go wherever you happen to place it. So that's one key thing that people want to know about. GM only, I should have mentioned this on the terrain as well, because terrain has a GM only box as well. So I can mark things, whether it's a feature or if it's terrain or shapes or anything, I can mark it as GM only, and then I can put it on the map here and go ahead and then turn off GM only here, and we're going to see it disappear. So I can share a player's map I can turn this off, share it with my players, and then turn it back on. Other key stuff here, you can override the scale of those icons. So if I wanted to place the next one, if I wanted to show that it was particularly tall for some reason, just make it more prominent, I can override the default. I need to check the box first, but then you're going to see that the scale is, and then if I do both, if I check both boxes, you can then make the scale, in this case it'll make it wider, I'm sorry. So its height is here, so if I want to make it tall, I need to make it 100 here and 75 here, for example. And that will make it taller than usual, as opposed to wider than usual, the way I had it set before. Rotating, so you can rotate it here. You can set, there's not a lot of reason to use that with this icon set. This is more typically going to be used for the settlement maps and for battle mats. But if you wanted to rotate it, you can see that that's rotated a little bit. This is brand new, just written in the past day or two, not yet released, but it'll be in the next update in 1.05 or so, beta 1.05. But if I wanted to preset and rotate it in two fixed locations, this is just a quicker way for you to get different rotate values. So you don't have to click twice or click and then type in the number. You can just go ahead and click it here, and it's going to try to match it to the nearest 15 degrees in this case. So that if you're trying to rotate things by 45 degrees or even 30 degrees, then it'll work for you. So let's set this back to 0. It's 0 up on the top there. You've got flip options, overriding the color. So if I wanted to override the color and put all of one forces in white, for example, I can make one side all in white, and then I can make the other side could be black, or the other side can be dark red, but whatever I'd like to have for my different forces, I can do that. You can add a ring around the icons as well, which is typically used for traveler sector maps, if you will. And they've got different codes for what a yellow ring means versus a red ring and so forth. But it's also useful here. You can say in a fantasy world, hey, that area is quarantined, for example. And we've got a number of these available for you. That's just the tip of the iceberg. You've got a ton of icons here to choose from. You can hover over any of them to see what they mean, what they're all about. You've got, again, we've got that same favorites functionality. You've got battle mat stuff for those map types. Structures are for your settlement maps, top-down views of cities and so forth. But even within these, you might want to use some of these creature things to show which creatures are prevalent where. Hey, there's a dragon flying around over here. Maybe this is a good use for our circle. In fact, that almost makes it into a token. Interesting. Select, so I can select a given icon here, and I can also pull up notes about that particular icon. So it will oftentimes, for many of the default types, it'll give you some stub information that you can choose to use, or you can ignore it and remove it, your choice. But a lot of the castles and cities and so forth will have little bits of data that it will generate about that particular location. And if I were to save that, you would see that it would be a note on the map. In fact, well, let's save it. So let's do that. Let's save it. Let's go to Add, Edit, View, Note. And so you can see that little yellowish square there just signifies that there's a note there, so I can click on that, and that's another way to get to that information. If I have Add, Edit, View, Notes set on, then that's another way to get that information. It won't generate it in that case. If you're using this and you're clicking on something, it's not going to generate data about a location. But this does have the advantage of I can add a note anywhere. It doesn't have to be tied to a particular location in this case. Yeah, if I hit that. There we go. So as opposed to right-clicking, if I left-click, it'll let me create the note. If I right-click, it's going to pull up a dialog with more options, which we'll get to in another video, because now we have crossed 32 minutes here. We haven't really even gotten into all the details of features. So we're going to do that in our next Worldographer 101 video. We'll continue. We'll probably recap what I just said on features, just to get a baseline for everyone to understand, and continue on, because features actually have, I've probably only done 15% of what features are all about, because we have labels that can be associated with them, decorations, so there's a lot more to it. And we'll get into shapes likely as well in that same video, maybe even labels. Maybe we'll finish off the main drawers over here. Some of the other drawers are used less frequently, so I'll probably save them for another video, but I'll try to attack a couple more of these. Again, that's all for World Kingdom Mapping, Worldographer 101, Basics. I think I do want to do one more thing though in this video, and that's just generate. Up here on the generate menu, I did allude to you can do these things later. So if I want to generate the coast, I can check a box for converting all the adjacent water hexes to sea, and then I can pick what coast type I like. I think we did a video recently on these in detail, which I'll link to as well, because it is 2025 based. But I'm going to use shapes for these coasts, hit OK, and it's going to go through the entire map, and not just we did this for one particular area, but now it's going through, and you can see that it's giving us a little bit of a progress indicator. It's getting 58, 60% of the way. For shapes, it does take a little bit longer than for features because it's got to calculate, first of all, which land hexes are adjacent to water hexes, and then for those, how many of their adjacent hexes are land, and then it's got to create a shape for each section and generate several points that it puts down. But you see, it doesn't take that long. So it does that. Then we can go to generate rivers. And here I can say how many rivers do I want on the map. So this map here is 20,000, 21,000 tiles. You can play with how many do you want it to create. I'm going to do a classic shape. So this is just going to be flat colors instead of being textured essentially. Hit OK. And it gives us a little bit of a status. And it tells it generated a few. And so you can see where those are. Here's this here going into that lake. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense for this one. So this is one that I might remove, and we can, when we get into the shape store, we'll talk about how to do that. If you don't like one, then you can go ahead and remove it and regenerate again. And they're all just shapes, so you can just move the points around, and we'll get to that when we go into the other video. Then we would do generate nations and empires. I typically do these in order. So I'm going to set this to be separate colors, and we've created 20 nations. So we're going to tell it to try to put 20 nations on the map. And so it goes, and you can see how instantly it does that. All these things are fully editable. You can move them all around. They're just features. All the buildings are just, or all the city icons and so forth are just features. So we can move them around. Just hit select and move it around. We can make it place freely now too, and then we have more control over where we move it around. Labels, we can move those around in a similar way, and so forth. Likewise, we can pull up the notes about that particular feature and make edits to those. Generating hex crawl locations, so this will just create more stuff on our map. You can hit OK, and you can see it just went through the whole map and just added a 10% more. Every hex had a 1 in 10 chance. Every land hex had a 10% chance, and every water hex had a 2% chance of getting some special feature with a little note on there as well. Then we have generate roads. This is new in Worldographer 2025. Actually, the hex crawl stuff is new too. But yeah, so in generate roads, and do we want to include the villages and so forth? I don't. No, actually I do. Yeah, because we made it all doable in one step. So this is, how do I want my lines to be drawn just straight from point to point, or give them a little bit of a randomness to them, or make them into smooth curves? What color do I want the roads to be? For the roads that are going to more remote locations like little villages and ruins, I can give that a different color. Hit OK. Ooh. So you can see where it added in all of these roads throughout the whole map. All right, that covers it for real this time. I think I added an extra 6 minutes when I was first trying to wrap up, but hopefully that gives you a good overview on kind of the first half of creating maps in Worldographer. You'd want to go up to File, go to File Save to save the map. If you can export the map as an image or a PDF using these controls here. And we'll probably do a third video where we get into many of these details. But for now, we're pushing 40 minutes already. So I'm gonna pause it there and get back to you guys in a few days with another video going over more features, shapes, labels, and probably a little bit more. I hope that the tool is useful to you. Take a look at the links below for links to the other videos that I've mentioned, as well as to download Worldographer. There is that free version that has 90% of the functionality is available to you without a license. So give it a try and see if it's a good fit for you. If it is, come back and support us so we can keep making the tool better. Like I said, we do updates a month or so. So thanks a bunch.